In this video, I will be discussing the Supreme Court case Chavez vs. Gonzalez GR number 168338 happened on February 15, 2008. This case is important because it involves constitutional rights, freedom of expression, government power, and the application of Republic Act 4200, or also known as the Anti-Wiretapping Act. So my goal in this reflection is to explain what the case is about, summarize the facts, identify the issues raised, discuss the ruling of the Supreme Court, and finally share my takeaways and insights from the case, especially in relation to civil liberties and government accountability. So first, let's talk about what this case is about. So Chavez versus Gonzalez centers on the government's attempt to prevent the media from broadcasting wiretap conversations allegedly involving President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo and a COMELEC commissioner known as the Hello Garci tapes. So the government, through the Secretary of Justice and the National Telecommunications Commission, issued warnings and directives to the media, telling them to stop airing these recordings, and they claimed that the tapes were obtained illegally under RA4200, the Anti-Wiretapping Act. And in response, lawyer and former Solicitor General Francisco Frank Chavez filed a petition before the Supreme Court, arguing that the government's actions violated freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and the people's rights to information. So in short, this case is about whether the government can use RA 4200 as a basis to stop the press from broadcasting allegedly illegal recordings, and whether such act violates the constitutional protections of free expression. So next, let's talk about the facts of this case. So this controversy began in 2005 when the Hello Garci scandal erupted. Several recordings surfaced allegedly capturing conversations between President Arroyo and COMELEC Commissioner Virgilio Garciliano during the 2004 election period. So these conversations appeared to discuss influencing the voting results. So when this recording circulated, radio stations started playing the tapes. And this caught the attention of the DOJ Secretary Raul Gonzalez and warned media outlets that broadcasting the tapes could violate RA 4200. And also, NTC reminded networks that their broadcast licenses can be suspended or revoked if they continue airing illegally obtained materials. So media organizations reacted sharply. They argued that the warnings were thinly veiled threats designed to silence them. So these warnings created a chilling effect, making journalists fear possible criminal prosecution or suspension of their broadcast franchises. For his part, Francisco Chavez filed a petition to stop the government from intimidating the media. He claimed that Department of Justice and National Telecommunications actions were unconstitutional prior restraint, and which is a government action that limits speech even before the speech takes place. So the government defended itself by saying that the recordings were illegal under RA 4200 and broadcasting them would amount to participation in an unlawful act, and therefore they insisted that restricting the broadcast was justified. So this conflict between allegedly illegality and the right to free expression set the stage for the Supreme Court's review. So let's talk about the issues in this case. So there were several legal issues raised, but the most relevant, especially for this discussion, were the first one is that did the DOJ and NTC violate the constitutional guarantee of freedom of speech and freedom of the press by warning media outlets not to broadcast the Hello Garci tapes. And this deals with whether the warnings constituted prior restraint, and which is almost always unconstitutional. Second issue is that does RA 4200 allow the government to stop media from airing wiretap conversations that were allegedly obtained illegally. So, the government claimed that the media had no right to broadcast something obtained through illegal wiretapping. And the next issue is that the third, do media organizations commit a crime under RA4200 simply by airing illegally obtained recordings? And even if they did not make the recordings themselves, this is important because the law imposes criminal penalties only on specific acts. So these issues revolve around balancing two things. So protecting privacy through the anti-wiretapping law and versus protecting the free flow of information and free expression. So next, let's talk about the ruling of the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court says that they are ruled in favor of Francisco Chavez and against the Department of Justice and NTC. So these are the key points of their ruling. So first is that the government's warnings amounted to unconstitutional prior restraint, and the court held that statements from DOJ and NTC were not mere advice but threats, and these statements had the effect of intimidating the media into stopping their broadcast. So they also emphasized that any form of prior restraint is presumed unconstitutional unless the government proves otherwise, which it failed to do. Next is that the government cannot use RA4200 to justify censorship. And they clarified that RA4200 penalizes the act of secretly tapping or recording private conversations without the consent of both parties. The law also punishes the act of playing such recordings if the one who plays them was also the one who illegally recorded them. But importantly, media organizations are not criminally liable under RA4200 for broadcasting illegally obtained recordings if they were not involved in the original illegal wiretap. The court said that if media was not part of the illegal interception, then playing the recording does not fall under the acts penalized by RA4200. Therefore, the government had no legal basis to stop the media. So, next is that freedom of speech and the press must be given the highest protection. So, the court highlighted the public interest was extremely high in this case because the recordings involved allegations of electoral fraud by a sitting president and information that affects the integrity of the democratic institutions is part of what the Constitution protects. And next is that the government violated the people's right to information. So they suppressed the broadcast, preventing citizens from accessing information and that could affect public opinion and government accountability. So if I were to sum it up, these warnings issued by the DOJ and NTC were unconstitutional, invalid, and should be stopped since RA4200 cannot be used as a tool to silence the press. So my takeaways for this case is that one is that freedom of the press is fragile since the government doesn't always need to pass a law to restrict speech. Sometimes warnings are enough to intimidate journalists. This case teaches that even subtle threats can be unconstitutional. Next is that the anti-wiretapping law must be understood carefully. Since it protects privacy but it has limits. The law punishes illegal wiretapping and those who directly participate in it, but it does not automatically criminalize the media. Understanding this distinction prevents the abuse of this law. So next, the I learned is that public interest outweighs discomfort. So even if the recordings were obtained illegally, the content involved potential election manipulation. And the court recognized that transparency is more important in such situations. So lastly is that this case strengthened the concept of chilling effect. So chilling effect happens when people avoid exercising their rights out of fear, and that the court emphasized that such fear is dangerous to democracy. Democracy. And in summary, Chavez versus Gonzalez is a landmark case affirming that the government cannot suppress speech by hiding behind RA4200. So its ruling strengthens press freedom, the right to information, and the democratic principles that protect citizens from abuses of authority. So for students like us, it is a powerful reminder that laws exist not only to control behavior but also protect our fundamental liberties. And understanding cases like this helps us appreciate the balance between governmental authority and individual rights.